All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Josh. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the library. I just have a couple of housekeeping things to talk to you about before we get started with tonight's program. First things first, please silence your phones if you could. The Book Loft is selling back there if you want to buy any books, and Dale will be signing after they talk. And then last thing, this event will probably end after the library is closed, which is fine. If you do need to take the elevator or take the ramp, just let me know and I'll walk you out that way. It can get a little lost. If you can take stairs, we can go right out this way and it takes you right to the loading dock and you get to see some fun behind the scenes library stuff along the way. On to tonight's program. About our moderator, Doug Petcash joined the WBNS 10 TV team in 2023 as a political reporter and anchor of Face the State. Doug has been awarded 8 regional news Emmys as well as 2 regional Edward R. Morrow Awards, among others. And our author tonight, Dale Butland, has 46 years of experience in government and political communications. For nearly 2 decades, he worked for the late U.S. Senator and astronaut John Glenn, serving as his press secretary, Ohio Chief of Staff, and reelection campaign director. Please help me welcome our guests.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Before we get into the questions with Dale, I just want to say that with my Sunday show, Face the State, Dale has appeared on it several times as a political strategist, talking about different races or political issues that have come up, and also recently to talk about his book as well. And he's done interviews with me kind of at the last minute, call him up, whether it's by Zoom or Teams or something like that, or meeting me at the station to give his expertise. And so for me, it's an honor to be able to return the favor to Dale and be here for him tonight to have this discussion. So Dale, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, first of all, Dale, the question that comes to my mind when somebody writes a book is why? So why don't we start with, why did you decide to put this down into the pages of a book?
So first of all, I would like to thank the library, Josh and Sam Szymanski, Zach Parrish, and want to thank you for moderating and all of you for coming tonight. With that out of the way, the answer to your question is 3 of the reasons are sitting right up front here. These are my grandchildren, and I wrote the book largely for my grandkids and also for my children. But I wanted, Vicki and I, that's my wife Vicki in the second row, we have 5 children and we have 11 grandkids now, which is probably proof positive that our family should start negotiations with the Planned Parenthood Association. But in any event, I wanted my children and my grandchildren to know, many of my grandchildren are pretty young, want them to know some point down the road what their grandfather did, why and how he spent his career, and why he thought it was important. And not just for my grandchildren, but maybe for other kids too, if we can get a generation and the next generation and maybe the one after that to realize that politics is not a dirty word. It's something that all of us have to be involved in as citizens. Maybe not at the level that I was, but just as citizens, to pay attention to what's going on in the country, what's going on in the world, to read the news, that's what is required in a democracy. That's what our founders thought and believed was necessary to keep this democracy going, was a well-informed citizenry. So if I can convince even a few people that that's worthwhile, then it would have been very worthwhile to write the book.
Well, I did read the book in preparation for our interview, and I would have read it even if you weren't coming on the show, because obviously I like politics too. But it's When Ohio Was Blue, my 20-year journey with John Glenn. So you started working for John Glenn in one capacity, I believe as a speechwriter at first, right. But then ended up wearing many hats over those 2 decades plus with the senator. Can you talk about the different roles that you played with him over the years?
Sure, yeah. As you say, Doug, in May of 1980, I was hired as a speechwriter, which was a job I never gave up during the whole 20 years that I worked for John. I was always the speechwriter. But then in 1984, after his presidential campaign ended, after he dropped out after a few primaries, that campaign did not go the way we hoped, but I became his press secretary then. That was in 1984. In 1988, I became his state director, where I was responsible for running the 4 offices that he had here in the state of Ohio. I was his Ohio chief of staff. And then in 1992, John asked me to run his last reelection campaign. And I did, and I'm very proud to say that was the campaign in which John became the only senator in our state's history to be elected to 4 terms. And that was the race that did that. So those are the different hats I wore.
You know, and I deal with a lot of press secretaries and communications directors in my job. Yeah. So I would have been calling you all the time, what's going on? I'm just curious, you know, was there a big moment or something that made it really stressful for you that you shared in the book that, you know, anecdotally, something, a big issue that you were dealing with the senator and how you make sure you get his words right and whatnot?
Yeah, well, there were several. Ironically, one of them occurred shortly after, in fact, very soon after I became press secretary. My first major foray on the national stage was to the Democratic Convention that year. That was 1984 in San Francisco. And John was meeting with some reporters in a scrum outside the convention hall, and I used to always carry a tape recorder with me, a small tape recorder that I would have so that I could tape his remarks just in case he was ever misquoted in the press. Well, I had turned my recorder off, the media scrum was over, people were making their way out, and one reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer stayed behind. And so I was only half listening because the reporter had asked him something, a question now that I've really forgotten about, the Korean War. John Glenn, as you may know, was a veteran of the Korean War. He got his reputation, or his nickname is the MiG Mad Marine in that war because he shot down 4 Soviet-made MiGs in the closing days of the war. But anyway, the reporter was asking him about it, and I didn't hear the question, but what I did hear was John using the word gook. And when I saw that the reporter's tape recorder was still on, my heart sank. My stomach was turning. So I thought, well, I have to think fast. So John, at this point, concluded his answer and went back into the convention hall. So I walked over to the reporter and I said, now you do realize that that conversation you just had with John was off the record. Well, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, nothing that you say to a reporter is off the record unless both parties, both the reporter and the person making the words, agree to it. And the agreement has to be struck before the comments are uttered, right? So
this is true.
So I knew that, and I knew the reporter knew it too. So he looks at me, looks me in the eye, turns off his recorder, and he says, if you're asking me if I'm going to burn him, you can relax. I won't. So that whole thing stunned me. I talked to the senator later. He had no recollection of using the word. And what was so odd about this is John had a 100% civil rights voting record. In the 20 years I worked for him, that was the only time I ever heard him utter a racially tinged remark. I knew what he felt about racism and the people who use racist language. And so the only explanation I could come up with was that this was like a throwback to the war, to the Korean War, where language like that was used not to insult an entire race of people, but to sort of diminish the enemy soldiers. And that's the only thing that made sense to me. And but you know, human beings are complicated, and we're a bundle of contradictions. But that was one that was a harrowing time.
And you didn't have to go into emergency control mode after that because of the reporter's stance. Along those lines, you write that you feel that he was one of the most, or if not the most, open-minded politician you ever worked for or knew.
Yeah, he was far and away the most open-minded politician that I ever worked for. It wasn't that he was wishy-washy or easily swayed. He had very strong principles. He had a core set of convictions. He had an unwavering sense of right and wrong. But he had something that was rare then, and I think even rarer now, maybe in politics, and that is that John had a genuine sense of humility. He accepted that he might not always be right, and that he might genuinely benefit from hearing other points of view. I often wondered where that came from, because it's certainly not something you would necessarily expect from a war hero and a 23-year veteran of the Marine Corps, an astronaut, a fighter pilot, and all the rest. And I concluded that his open-mindedness may have been the product of another one of his attributes, which was an unquenchable curiosity. And it was something he'd said that he'd had since he was a child, and something that he had often observed in other successful people that he'd met throughout his life, whether it was the renowned heart surgeon Michael DeBakey, or rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, or the man who became one of his best friends, the former U.S. Senator, Attorney General, and 1968 presidential candidate Bobby Kennedy. He said that they were curious about everything, not just things in their field, but everything. So I think that curiosity is probably the reason for his open-mindedness. And in the book, I talk about a couple of instances and times where his open-mindedness caused him to change a position on some hot-button controversial issues. One was same-sex marriage. The other was a 1995 proposed amendment to the Constitution to ban burning of the American flag. John changed his position on both of those things at great peril to himself, by the way, political peril to himself. And I'd be glad to talk about those further if anybody's interested in the Q&A that follows this. Go ahead.
We mentioned you wore many hats for and with Senator Glenn. But then you also were put out on loan, as you would say, throughout your career with him. You would take these, not calling them a sabbatical, but side hustles. I guess that's what we'd call it now, right? And you would go and actually be on loan working for other politicians, whether it's in a campaign or, I'm not sure if it was in their official office, but at least in a campaign situation. Do you have a couple examples of those?
Yeah, sure. 1988, I was on loan to Howard Metzenbaum, who is the other U.S. Senator from Ohio at the time for Howard's last reelection campaign. In 1990, I was on loan to a Democratic wunderkind by the name of Sherrod Brown, who at that early time was running for re-election as Secretary of State. And then in 1994, I was on loan to Joel Hyatt, who was trying to succeed his father-in-law, Howard Metzenbaum, in the Senate. And then another interesting, so after John left the Senate, after he retired in January of 1998, I went with him and I started my own company, a consulting company, and I had some interesting clients. Among them was the talk show host Jerry Springer. Yes, that Jerry Springer.
Mayor Jerry Springer.
Well, he was former mayor of Cincinnati. Yeah, he was an intriguing character. Most people only know him as the host of that, what he used to call my silly show, and other people call the epitome of trash TV. But there was a whole other complex side to Jerry that I thought was so fascinating that I gave him a chapter in my book. Do
you mind sharing a little bit of that story without giving the whole thing away? Or
which one?
About Jerry.
About Jerry? Sure. Well, Jerry was, he was whip smart, highly educated, had his bachelor's degree from Tulane, had a law degree from Northwestern Law School, had been, as you say, had been mayor of Cincinnati. Once he got out of politics. He went into TV journalism, was the anchor at the NBC affiliate in Cincinnati, was there for, I think, 8 years or something. He won 7 Emmys for his commentary, and took that station from last in the ratings to first in the ratings in Cincinnati, and that's before he decamped for Chicago, where he started doing his show. But anyway, Jerry was charmingly self-effacing. And I remember a story that he told me. He'd been a lifelong baseball fan and a lifelong Yankees fan, because he had been raised in Queens, New York, after his family fled Poland to escape the Holocaust. Jerry was actually born in London during the Blitz, when the Nazis were bombing London. But they made their way to America. Jerry was raised in Queens, always been a Yankees fan. So he went to a Yankees baseball fantasy camp that his wife had bought him as a birthday present. He said it was so cool because on the last day of camp, we campers got to play in a Yankees Legends exhibition game against retired Yankee legends. He said the game was always a sellout because so many Yankee fans wanted to see their favorite old timers back in pinstripes again. So he said on the team I was on, Jerry was on, he said I was the catcher and the great Whitey Ford was the pitcher. And he said about the 3rd or 4th batter up for the other team was Mickey Mantle. He said, now, Mickey Mantle was my childhood hero. And he said, I got so excited being that close to the Mick that my glasses started to fog up, and I was afraid I couldn't see anything. He said, so I didn't know what else to do, so I called timeout, and I went out to the mound. And I said, Whitey, I told him what the problem was. Mickey's my childhood hero, my glasses are fogging, I'm afraid I won't see your pitches. He says, Whitey comes off the mound, puts his arm around my shoulders. He said, now everybody up in the stands thinks we're talking about strategy. But what Ford actually said to me was, Springer, Mantle hasn't had a bat in his hand in 3 years. He's drunk on his butt. Get the hell back behind the plate. Now, I got to tell you, I've also, because this is a public library and we have younger people here, I've cleaned that story up a little bit. But you can get the unexpurgated version in the book as to what Whitey actually told him.
Got to be careful with adjectives.
Yes,
right.
yes, indeed.
Yeah. You mentioned the late Senator Metzenbaum.
Yeah.
He and Senator Glenn had quite an interesting relationship. Went from not so good to then good, but it was a transition that happened over time. What was the thing that they were butting heads over, and then what ended up being the resolution to that kind of brought them together?
Yeah, so there was a feud between Howard and John that actually came from the fact that they ran against each other twice in Democratic primaries. In 1970, Howard beat John narrowly by, I think, a point, but then went on to lose the general. That set up four years later, another primary that they ran against each other in, which turned out to be an angry, bitter primary. And I won't go into all the details here, but I do in the book. I kind of explain why that became so angry and bitter. But anyway, it was. John beat Howard in that primary, then went on to win his seat in the Senate. Howard joined him 2 years later in 1976. But it's fair to say that in their first years together in the Senate, the two men not only didn't like each other very much, they actually despised one another. And you could even see it in such low, the staffs mirrored their bosses' animosity toward each other. And you could even see it in such low stakes thing as the Senate Summer Softball League. And I won't go into those stories now, but anyway, so there was this animosity. It finally ended in 1984, shortly after I became press secretary, and I have to say that it is probably the event that I am most proud of orchestrating. What happened was, in 1984, there was a conservative newspaper in Washington called the Washington Times, which was owned by the Reverend Sung Young Moon. Those of a certain age may remember he was a leader of the cultish Unification Church, they called it. But anyway, he ran this conservative newspaper, and they ran an editorial called Senator Metzenbaum's Red Face, which was ostensibly an attack on Howard for having accepted a fee for arranging a real estate transaction. But in fact, Senator Metzenbaum's red face was a double entendre, because it ran in conjunction with another editorial on that same day that dredged up these decades-old allegations of Senator Metzenbaum's supposed communist ties when he was a young man, and actually referred to Metzenbaum as, and I quote, an unrepentant Stalinist. So I went into Senator Glenn's office and I said, Senator, I think you ought to go to the floor of the Senate and defend Howard. And his first question is, and why would I do that? This is now you know there was this feud. And I said, I don't think you've read this yet. And I handed him the paper. He hadn't seen this newspaper. He read it while I stood by waiting. He finished it, he put it down on the table, and he said, you know, you're right. This is way over the line. He said, would you go write me a floor statement? Well, I had already written one because I thought he might say that, and I brought it back into him. And so then I made some calls. I called the Washington-based Ohio Press Corps, all of whom knew about the feud. And I said, Senator Glenn's going to go to the floor of the Senate. He's going to make some comments about Senator Metzenbaum. Well, I knew they'd all show up for that, because they thought there was going to be fireworks. I called Howard's press secretary, the late Roy Myers, and I said, Roy, I just want to give you a heads up. Senator Glenn's going to the floor of the Senate to talk about your boss. And there's a long pause. And he said, what's he going to say? And I wouldn't give him any preview, except I said, I think you'll be pleased. So I won't go into all the things that Howard said that day on the floor of the Senate, but he ended it by quoting the unrepentant Stalinist line out of the newspaper. And he said, Senator Metzenbaum and I have had our differences, but he is a loyal, patriotic American who has served this country with courage and distinction. And he deserves far better than to be smeared with this kind of warmed over McCarthyism. John wasn't back in the office for 5 minutes before Howard was on the phone calling in to thank him. Howard volunteered to serve as honorary chair of John's reelection campaign in '86. 2 years later, John returned the favor, was Howard's honorary chair, and at Howard's request, loaned me to Howard to help on his last reelection campaign. So the feud was over, and the two got along very, very well thereafter.
You can come back together, right? Well, your book's title, When Ohio Was Blue, refers to the time from the mid-'70s through the early to mid-1990s when Democrats held most of the statewide offices in Ohio, if not all of them, kind of like the Republicans do now. What was different about that era from the one we're living in now?
Oh, it was very different. For one thing, it was a much simpler time in many ways. You have to remember, this was before cell phones. It was before the internet. It was before social media and all of the other advancements that we now take for granted. And I think largely because of that, reading the news in a newspaper, which everybody did back then, or watching the news on TV when there were only 3 networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, was a kind of shared national experience, which I think is a major reason why politics then wasn't as coarse in practice or as harsh in tone as it is now.
So how about the politicians themselves? Do you think that there has been a change in demeanor, compromise, collaboration?
Absolutely. Look, back then, both Democrats and Republicans, John Glenn, Howard Metzenbaum, all of their contemporaries, looked at and thought about politics in a very different way than I think many politicians now do. Back then, politics wasn't war. Your opponent was not a treasonous enemy. Winning an election was not a license to grift, and losing one wasn't proof that it was rigged or stolen. And above all, Doug, as you just mentioned, politicians back then believed in compromise. They didn't view it as selling out. They knew that compromise is the way democracy is supposed to work. And in the competitive two-party system, it's the only way democracy can survive.
What do you think has brought about, if you believe that the polarization is par for the course now, what do you think has brought that about, and is there a way out?
Yeah, well, polarization may be too mild a word for what our country has been going through over the last number of years. Today, it seems often like the U.S. is divided into two warring countries, where Republicans and Democrats don't share common goals or even a common reality. I think that there are a number of reasons for it. On the economic front, I think it's been things like globalization and deindustrialization, which has killed tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs, has left people without a college education, without hope, and has widened the wealth gap into a chasm that we haven't seen the likes of since the Gilded Age of the 19th century. On the political side of things, we have the advent of ideologically driven cable networks in which we can cocoon ourselves and only hear the kinds of things that we want to hear. We can choose our news, basically. We have the rise of social media and fringe internet platforms that are fire hoses of misinformation and conspiracy theory.
I can tell you're a writer. Yeah. Fire hoses of misinformation. That's a good one. Yeah. I'm going to use that maybe.
So, and then of course we have the malign opportunists in our polity too, many of whom are Ivy League educated and certainly know better, or should know better, but who nevertheless fan the flames of cultural division for their own purposes. So all of these things together, I think, have led to a time when people are alienated, not just from each other, but from our economic system and our political institutions as well in this country.
In your book, you do talk about a number of reforms that you believe need to be made to rectify some of the political situation. One of them is gerrymandering, which has been in the news not only in Ohio a lot as we've gone through congressional and legislative redistricting, but now we're seeing battles in other states, Republicans voting to create more Republican districts in some states, Democrats doing the same thing in other states. When it comes to gerrymandering, what do you think the problem is, and how do you end it?
Because it's been so much in the news lately, I assume everybody here knows what gerrymandering is, right? It's the drawing of unfair legislative district lines that favor one party over the other. We had an opportunity here in Ohio a year ago to end gerrymandering in Ohio had we passed what was called Issue 1, which would have replaced politicians drawing these lines with an independent commission that would have been composed of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and five independents. It didn't win for reasons that I'll get to in a moment. But it's important to remember that gerrymandering has always existed in this country from almost the time we were founded. But back in the old days, it was imprecise. So oftentimes the districts ended up being a lot more competitive than those who were drawing the lines wanted them to be. But with the advent of computers now and other high-tech gadgetry, you can now literally go street by street and almost house by house and know exactly who's going to vote how. I'll tell you how bad it's gotten. There are 435 members of Congress, right? The Cook report, which is a nonpartisan, the Cook political report said that in 2024, out of those 435 districts, 36 were competitive. 36 out of 435 because of gerrymandering. So outside of a wave election, whether it's a red wave or a blue wave, outside of a wave election, the outcome of a general election is almost never in doubt. I think that the blatant unfairness of gerrymandering and the scorn that it has for the voters, Ohio's a good example. We're one of the most gerrymandered states in the nation. Over the last 10 years, Republicans have won 54% of all the votes cast for Congress in this state. But our congressional delegation, because of gerrymandering, is made up of 10 Republicans and 5 Democrats. A 2-to-1 margin, even though they've only won 54% of the vote. In the state house, it's even worse. But so anyway, there's a scorn for the voters there, and it's unfair. That would be reason enough to end it. But in my opinion, Doug, there's even something else about gerrymandering that makes it even more of a threat to our democracy, and that is this. It increases polarization. It perpetuates and increases the polarization that's threatening to tear our country apart. How does it do that? Remember that the outcome of a general election is almost never in doubt. So if you are an office holder, if you are a Republican office holder, or you're a Democratic office holder, the only threat you have comes in the next primary election, right? So if you're a Republican, you fear being attacked from the right. If you're a Democrat, you fear being attacked from the left. Which means that there's no incentive for politicians of either party to compromise or cooperate with the other side. As a matter of fact, it's just the reverse. You can best ensure your longevity in office by being intransigent and not cooperating, not compromising. Because if you do that, that will satisfy your party's base and lessen the chances that you'll draw a competitor in the next primary. But what if we could get rid of gerrymandering, what if, instead of doing it the way we're doing it now, what if districts were drawn so that each district was comprised, insofar as practicality and the law allows, an equal number of Democrats and Republicans? Now, all of a sudden, the whole dynamic is reversed. Why? Because if you're a Democrat, you know you got to get Republican votes to win. If you're a Republican, you know you got to have Democratic votes to win. So the whole dynamic now is in favor of compromise and cooperation and not being ideologically pure or extreme. And if you are, those candidates will soon learn that's a surefire ticket to Loserville, right? So I think we could improve things a whole lot by doing away with gerrymandering. And if you'll permit me, Doug, I know this is a long answer, but I think this is an important subject. It won't be easy, and it can't be done by passing a federal law. And the reason is because in this country, elections are not run by the federal government, they're run by the states, which means 50 different set of rules and regulations and so on. The Supreme Court has already ruled that gerrymandering for partisan purposes is outside the scope of federal law. So you can't end it by passing a law, which means that the only way to end it is to go state by state. That's going to take a much longer time, obviously, but it is doable. Now, here in Ohio, why did issue 1 go down? The polls were overwhelming. People in this state, whether they're Republican or Democrat or independent, overwhelmingly want to get rid of gerrymandering. There was a hopeful start at the beginning of the campaign. The bipartisan coalition that was sponsoring issue 1 had 60% more than the number of signatures they needed to get it on the ballot. And yet, in the end, it became a pitched partisan battle. And that's because the people who benefited from gerrymandering. In this case, it's Republicans. And by the way, I want to make clear this. The numbers that I was quoting before are equally lopsided except going the other way in states where Democrats hold the pencil and are drawing the line. So both sides are equally guilty of this. Well, anyway, here in Ohio is Republicans who benefited from gerrymandering. No tactic was too extreme and no ruse was too odious for these self-seeking politicians to try to hang on to their ability to draw these self-serving maps. So they resort, with the help of a Secretary of State who, let us say, does not embarrass easily, they even stooped to writing misleading and false ballot language, which said that issue 1 would require gerrymandering to continue, when in fact that's the exact opposite of what it was designed to do. And if you don't believe that that was intentional, the chairman of the state Republican Party gave a speech in January of 2025, which I quote in my book, gave it in Sandusky County to a county dinner there. And he said, and I quote him directly, "Confusing Ohioans was not such a bad idea, was it?" Because of the ballot language, many people who voted no mistakenly thought that they were voting against gerrymandering, right? All right, so issue 1 was a setback. Four states, by the way, have taken the plunge and have taken the pencil away from the politicians and given it to a commission. I believe that even though this was a setback, I believe that in the end this is going to be successful because I think people overwhelmingly want fair maps that allow the voters to choose their legislators rather than legislators choosing their voters. So I think sooner or later they're going to see through the smoke and mirrors that are employed by the self-serving politicians. I think they're going to demand common sense reform, not just in Ohio, but all across the nation. And sooner or later, I think we will get rid of gerrymandering once and for all.
And you touched on it, Dale, and I just want to emphasize it a little bit too. You were in Democratic politics your entire career. You would make the same argument if the Democrats were in power now against gerrymandering?
Absolutely, and in fact I have, and in among other places in the book, and I'm still a Democrat, but yes, I think gerrymandering is just a really bad idea, and I think, as I said, for all the reasons I described, I think it's inherently destructive to our democracy.
We're getting a little bit closer to when we want to have some Q&A from the audience, but I do want to ask you, Dale, one of the things, back to Senator Glenn. He had flown and orbited the Earth in the 60s, but he had to wait a really long time to take his second flight into space. What's the story behind the wait and then what it meant to him to be able to go back into space at the age of 77?
So all the original 7 Mercury astronauts were promised that they would each have 2 flights, at least 2 flights. John only got 1. And despite the fact he was passed over time and time again for another flight after his orbital flight. And he couldn't understand why. Nobody was at NASA was willing or was able or willing maybe to tell him why. It wasn't until years later that he found out why. And the reason was, after he became the first American to orbit the Earth, he was one of the most celebrated figures in the world, a national hero here, and President Kennedy thought that if John were to fly again and he were to be killed, it would be a public relations disaster for the U.S. and for the U.S. space program. And remember, we were still in the space race to the moon with the Soviet Union back then. So he ordered NASA quietly to keep John grounded, to keep him out of harm's way. And it wasn't until John was 77 years old that he got his second flight. And that came about because NASA was involved in a lot of research at the time, and they, among other things, they were looking at the effects of space travel on the aging process. And John was chairman of the Special Committee on Aging in the Senate, and he sensed an opportunity here. And he thought, well, you know, they already have a baseline on me, so I'd be a perfect fit for this kind of research. And he lobbied NASA incessantly, and finally they agreed to make him a mission specialist on this shuttle flight. So he did, and I'm glad to say that my wife and our children were able to were able to watch that launch. It's the only launch I've ever seen. And we were, I tell you, it is absolutely awe-inspiring. We were in the family section, so we were a good bit closer than most of the public was able to be. But even at that distance, even of a mile, you can feel the sound waves. When that thing lifts off, you can feel the sound waves beating against your chest. It's that powerful. I mean, this red-orange flame comes out. I mean, it is an awe-inspiring sight. Anyway, on his second flight, John was up. His first flight, he was up for 5 hours, I think. He orbited the Earth three times. He was up for a number of days the second time around and orbited the Earth, I think, 124 times or something like that. Everything went well. I remember telling the Ohio Press Corps at the time, this was after John was safely back on Earth, but I said to him, you know, it's the first time that a senior citizen has ever left Florida in something other than a Winnebago. But John got back safely. That's not to say there was no drama when he returned, and the reason is when you're in space for an extended period of time, weightlessness has an effect on the body, and I won't go through all what they are now. You can read that in the book. But anyway, the bottom line is that many of the astronauts, even younger ones, have trouble walking when they exit the spacecraft after they're up in an extended period of weightlessness. So NASA was convinced that at John's age, you know, at his advanced age, he would need a wheelchair when he got off the shuttle. And one was waiting for him there. And John told me later, he said, you know, I knew the world was going to be watching, and I was determined to walk off that craft under my own power, even if it killed me. And he said, and I will tell you, I'm not going to lie, it was hard, but I gritted my teeth and I did it. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's what you call the right stuff.
I love that you ended it that way, because I think that's perfect now transition where we can bring the audience into the discussion. Josh has a microphone if anyone would like to ask Dale a question, and we can take those. However, just raise your hand and we can bring the microphone to you.
Mr. Butland.
Yes, Ms. Hedden.
Do you have a favorite John Glenn story that you would like to share with us?
Oh, I've got many. And I should say, by the way, among the audience members here are Herb and Melissa Hedden, two of my very dear friends who also worked for Senator Glenn back during the time that I was there. Herb, if I remember correctly, you came on during the presidential campaign, is that right? And you were involved in the legal side of things. Herb is a very distinguished lawyer, and I think that's how you were involved then. But anyway, but the Heddens have been just wonderful friends over the years, and I'm so glad that they're here tonight. A favorite John Glenn story. I've got a lot of John Glenn stories. Let's see.
Flying in a small plane?
Well, yeah, that's one that was, I don't know, that's my favorite, but the one he's talking about is that John had a little twin-engine Beech Baron airplane that he'd fly back and forth from Washington to Ohio. And he never got a jet, even though he certainly could have afforded one, but every county in Ohio, 88 counties in Ohio, all of them have airports. But in some of the more rural counties and stuff, the runways are not long enough to accommodate a jet. So John kept his twin-engine Beech Baron because he can get into every airport in Ohio with props. And when oftentimes it was just John and I flying back and forth from Washington to Ohio. And he would inevitably do this with me, and he would do it with other staff people who flew, press who sometimes accompanied us would get what I would call the co-pilot treatment, where John would put you in the co-pilot seat, he'd put a set of headsets on you, and then off you'd go, and you'd be flying, and he would instruct you how to twist and turn these different knobs and levers and so forth on the control panel. And I have to confess that after almost 20 years of co-piloting, I have no clue what those knobs were designed to do that I was twisting. But I used to always tell my wife, Vicki, that I said, I'm not crazy about flying in small planes, but you can do worse if you have to fly in one. You can do worse than have John Glenn as your pilot, right? I said, the only real problem is if that plane ever goes down, I won't get mentioned till the 4th paragraph at least, and which will start also on board. so that's the plane story. But I think maybe one of my favorite stories about John is how he came to change his position on same-sex marriage. As I said earlier, he had a 100% voting record on civil rights. And back in the 80s, the early 80s, there was a bill that was a proposed bill on Capitol Hill that was known as the Gay Civil Rights Bill. And John didn't want to back it. He would not go on, and the staff, we talked to him over and over again. We couldn't get him to change his mind. And the reason was, he never discriminated himself, either in his Senate office or in our presidential campaign, against people who were gay or homosexual. In fact, the guy who was the finance chairman for our presidential campaign was openly gay. But John believed that sexual orientation was a choice. It was a choice that people made. And he said, because it's a choice, I just don't think it belongs in our civil rights laws alongside the ascriptive characteristics like race, creed, color, that people have no control over. This is a choice. So how that changed was he was running for president in 1984, and the fellow who was the chairman of our presidential campaign in the state of New York was a state senator whose district, as I recall, included Greenwich Village. And when his constituents found out about John's position on the Gay Civil Rights Bill, they went to that state senator and they said, look, we expect you to do one of two things. We expect you to, A, change his mind on the issue. If you can't do that, then number two is we expect you to resign from his campaign. If you do neither of those things, we're going to beat you the next time you run for election. So the state senator was in a bind. So he calls John up and he says, and he had already tried to talk John into a different position, never happened. But he says to John, would you at least agree to come and meet some of my constituents? John says, sure, I'll go anywhere, talk to anybody. So the meeting was set up at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. The senator invited maybe 15 people from his district. They were all very successful people in law, engineering, architecture, so on. So the state senator starts the meeting. He says, I'll tell you what, why don't we start this way? Senator Glenn, why don't you start and explain why you're taking the position you have on the Gay Civil Rights Bill, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So John dives right in. And he says, well, I think discrimination is wrong. I don't think people should do it. But the reason I'm not supporting this bill is I think that your sexual orientation is a choice. And that's why I don't think it belongs in the same category as these other things. So he gets done, and there's dead silence in the room. Finally, a black woman who is an attorney by profession raises her hand. And she stands up and she says, Senator Glenn, I'm black and I'm a woman. Why in the world would I choose to be gay? Well, it broke the room up, of course, and it, the tension that was there was, lifted. But the meeting concluded by John saying he would continue to think about the issue. A couple of weeks later, he changed his mind. And he said, that meeting got me thinking about my own sexual orientation. And he said, it wasn't something I chose. It was the way I was straight for as long as I can remember. It was the way I was born. And I was no more capable of changing that than I was capable of changing the color of my skin. And if that's true for me, it's true of everybody else too. And that removes whatever legal justification there might have been for not including this. So that's how John came to change his position on same-sex marriage. There were other examples of times that he changed his mind too that I think you would enjoy reading in the book.
And another question from the audience?
There seems to be so much money to be made by being a legislator. How different do you think the legislators really are today, or is it really just one party? We have Democrats as a label, Republicans as a label, but they all just want to get reelected. And if they have a legislative meeting where they decide on a health care issue, they'll insider trade. It's been well documented. They'll buy a pharmaceutical company that's going to benefit from this before it's public information. More recently, you've had people trading oil futures ahead of presidential announcements. And so how different are the two parties today? Or, as you said about gerrymandering, does everybody just say, you know what, life's pretty good here in Washington?
Well, that's a really good question. And let me say that I think corruption is a real problem. Now, with John Glenn, let me just use him as a counter example. When he was in the Senate, he put everything he had into a blind trust. And if you're familiar with what a blind trust is, it is run by a financial person, but you don't know what holdings you have, and he doesn't tell you. All you get at the end of every year is a statement showing how much you made or how much you lost, but you have no idea into where your money is invested. And the reason for that is to take away the possibility that you might be feathering your own nest and voting for things that will enrich you. And I think more politicians today ought to do it. At the very least, I think there ought to be a law barring politicians, certainly from any from profiting from the insider information they have about what policies may be passed or what laws may be passed next. But I do think there's a difference between the parties. I think there's a very real difference, between the parties. But I do think that corruption is a common problem. I do think that there's way too much money in politics now, although I don't know how you get rid of it, thanks to the Supreme Court and the Citizens United decision. We tried to limit money in campaigns some years ago, and then the Supreme Court struck that down. So it's really hard. But I do think that maybe we ought to consider. Both parties ought to consider, although let's face it, it's not going to happen. But there's far too much PAC money floating around, which can be given in an unlimited amount, as you know, and that I think is a real problem. And I understand why people get frustrated, and I understand why people get cynical. Because they see this stuff and they say, is nobody honest anymore? I think that there are honest people. Unfortunately, I think the dishonest ones are the ones that get the press and get, the attention. But I do think that there are other politicians on both sides of the aisle who are decent human beings and who are not using their offices to profit. Certainly we can hope that there will be more, in future years.
Gentleman over here, I believe.
Yeah, there was one gentleman here, and then I'll get you.
Mr. Butland, if I may, I have a few comments and then a question. I had the opportunity to meet with you when I did a fundraiser for Senator Glenn at my home in Worthington Hills, and I met you, and you look a lot younger and polished and much healthier. I thought I would see you as much older than what I remember seeing you. So that was 35 years ago. when he ran against Mike Devine.
Yes.
Remember the last time he ran?
Yes.
And I had the opportunity to do fundraiser at my home in Worthington Hills. And at that time, there was a session, Senate session about budgeting, and Senator could not come. But his wife, Annie, and their daughter, I can't remember her name now. Lynn. Yeah, who was about our age, I think, at that time. I'm pretty old now, but so I know Annie and Glenn, Senator, both passed away. And so he called us on the phone and talked to us. And we were a bunch of Asian Indians. So, of course, he talked about India and Pakistan and all that, which politicians tend to do. But then, you remember, when he ran for president, he had a great deal of debt.
Yes.
So he started calling, he called me, and my wife and I flew to Washington, D.C., and President Bill Clinton met there, and we all were there at a museum, and I had opportunity to meet with Senator Glenn at that time, in person, and of course, Bill Clinton too. Now, my question was, there was some legislative issue that number of senators, like Senator Glenn, maybe McCain, and some other senators supported, that had to do with either loans or savings and loans, and there was some blemish about that, and they all came out clean. Well, would you consider commenting on that? I forgot what happened.
Sure.
Sorry for the long question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for hosting the fundraiser all those years ago. And if I understood you correctly, you're saying that you think I look younger now than I did then? Is that what you're... And if that's the case, I can only say it's because I met you in the middle of a campaign, and campaigns can do a number on you. But I wish I looked as young as I did back then. So what you're referring to, what the gentleman was talking about, is there was a scandal in which Senator Glenn got ensnared. It was called the Keating Five, and this was a situation where there was a guy whose last name was Keating, and who had been a Cincinnati businessman for a number of years, but then he decamped to Arizona, and he ran a savings and loan called Lincoln Savings and Loan. And this guy, Keating, had come to Senator Glenn and offered to help retire the senator's presidential debt. Now, I got to tell you, if any of you have been involved in politics in any way, you probably know that raising money for a campaign is always difficult. Raising money for a campaign that's over is even more difficult. Raising money for a campaign that's over and you lost is even more difficult. So it was really difficult to retire this debt that was left over from Senator Glenn's presidential campaign. The debt it was about $3 million, $2 million of which was owed to 4 Ohio banks, each of whom had loaned John $500,000. Now, John tried mightily to retire this debt. We held fundraiser after fundraiser, not just in Ohio, but around the country. The banks actually got back. We triaged the debt. So the mom and pop operations, sort of the little guys, got paid off pretty much everything that they were owed. The banks all got their entire principal back. So the only thing that was owed was the interest on the loan. John offered to, the banks, for their perspective, said, we just as soon get rid of this thing and get it off our books. We're willing to forgive the interest. The FEC said, nope, can't do that. That would be an illegal contribution to the Glenn campaign. John offered to pay it off himself personally, promising in return never to run again for president. Because at the time, if you're a presidential candidate and you accepted matching funds from the federal government, you could only contribute $50,000 of your own money into a campaign, which he had already done a long time before. FEC said, nope, we won't let you pay off the debt either with your own money because you've already reached the limit of what you can put in. So here we were in this kind of catch-22 debt limbo where we couldn't raise the money we needed from other people and he couldn't pay it off himself. It seemed like it was an anvil hanging around his neck forever. So enter Charles Keating, who comes to our office or sends a representative to our office and says, I'll help you raise money to get rid of this debt. The person in our office who was charged with helping reduce that debt glommed onto this opportunity. Some of us were very skeptical about this from the beginning because Charles Keating was a Republican, had never given a dime to any of John's campaigns before, was very active in anti-pornography efforts and anti-gay efforts in Cincinnati, which were traded in outright bigotry. And so we wondered why his sudden interest in helping our boss. Well, Keating starts to help with the fundraising, and it wasn't long before, surprise, surprise, he asked for a favor. And what he said is that the feds have been looking at my bank, Lincoln Savings and Loan, which was in Arizona. They have been looking at us for a long time, and a cloud has developed. It's hanging over my bank. And all I want them to do is either bring charges or stop the investigation, but this can't go on forever. So he enlists the support of Senator Glenn from Ohio, John McCain and Dennis DeConcini, they were two senators from Arizona, Don Regal of Michigan was another senator, and Alan Cranston of California was the fifth. They all meet with the regulators. John only met with them once, the others met several times. And in John's case, John said, and the investigation that was done by the ethics committee agreed, the only thing John said at this meeting was, I want you to either charge him or get off his back. That's all we're asking here. When the investigators told the senators that Keating was the subject of a criminal investigation, John said, I closed the file in my lap and I walked out of the meeting, and that's the last time he ever did anything. And so when the Keating 5 investigation, it led to a series of hearings on Capitol Hill. I'm droning on now for too long. But anyway, had a series of hearings on Capitol Hill. John was found to be not guilty of any crime. The only thing they criticized him for was exercising poor judgment in setting up a meeting between Keating's representative and the then Speaker of the House sometime later. So, you know, it was about as close to an exoneration as was possible at the time. I'll tell you one last little piece that you'll find interesting, because Washington is politics, right? And politics is the way the operation runs. The committee, the Senate Ethics Committee, it's the only committee in Washington that has an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. On all other committees, the party that has the most members of that House, whether it's the House or the Senate, has at least one more member than the minority party, so there's never a tie vote if they break along partisan lines. But the Ethics Committee is different. It's 3 and 3. There's 3 Democrats and there are 3 Republicans. The Ethics Committee hires a super lawyer out of Washington, whose name is Bob Bennett, to conduct an investigation. It goes on for almost a year. And he concludes and gives a report to the committee that John Glenn and John McCain should be cut loose from the investigation because they did nothing wrong. John assumes that the committee is going to follow the lead of its own prosecutor, that the guy they hired as special prosecutor. Well, this goes on and on. No word comes out. Finally, it wasn't until a long time later that John found out what happened. What happened was Howell Heflin, who is the Democratic senator from Alabama, was concerned that if Glenn and McCain were cut loose, it would become an all-Democrat scandal because McCain was the only Republican in the group. So the only way they could keep McCain in was to keep Glenn in too. So he lobbies the his 2 Democratic colleagues to reject the report and the recommendation of the special counsel and keep the two Johns in the investigation. That's how John came to go through these hearings. And it was all politics. It was pure. John was livid about the whole thing because his integrity was being challenged for the first time in his life, and he was forced to undergo this embarrassing and expensive hearings. I mean, he spent over $250,000 of his own money in defense fees, and this was back in the 80s, so that was a lot more money than it is now, for no other reason than pure politics. And I think, to the best of my knowledge, he never spoke to Howell Heflin again the entire time that they were in the Senate. But anyway, that's a long answer to your short question. I'm sorry.
I think we have time for one more question.
Do one more?
from the
Here you go.
audience.
Hi, I was wondering what your favorite part of public service was while working with John Glenn.
Sweetie, did you say favorite part? Favorite part of public service? That is a very good question, too. And I would say that, you know, when you're involved in public service, I was a staff person, right? I wasn't an elected person. Nobody elected me. I was working for someone that they elected. So I don't delude myself into thinking that I had some major impact on things. I like to think that maybe at the margins, I improved things a little bit during my 20 years there. Not because of anything I did, but because of advice I gave the senator that maybe he ended up taking and voted a certain way on different things. But one of the things I loved when I was working both in Washington and then back here as Ohio Chief of Staff, I loved to go to schools. I would get invited to go to schools lots of times to talk to kids, to talk to students about things, and to take their questions about politics and anything that was happening. I really enjoyed that a lot because I really believe that our kids are our future, which sounds, I guess, obvious, but I really think that that your generation of kids, there's a quote, Olivia, that I used in my book. I started the thing. It's a quote. It's a quote from Alfred Lord Tennyson, and it goes, "The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long." Well, I got to put my glasses on. I can't see here. That's what happens when you get old after these campaigns are over 35 years later. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks, the long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Olivia, as I think I wrote in your book, my generation has not found that newer world. I hope that your generation does. And that's one of the things I found most rewarding, was talking to kids your age and maybe even a little bit older, because I think it's so important that you become involved and you become good citizens and you become informed citizens. I think that's really important.
Well, Dale, I believe that it's customary for an author to share an excerpt from their work. I believe that you have one that you've chosen to share with the audience. Is this a good time for that?
Sure, Doug. I'd be happy to. And what I'd like to read will hopefully let us close on an optimistic note tonight. You know, there's no question that today our democracy is under such enormous stress that reasonable people, maybe even people in this room, reasonably wonder whether it can actually survive. But if Shakespeare was right when he told us in The Tempest that the past is prologue, then I think maybe there's good reason for hope, because after all, America has faced difficult days and seemingly insurmountable challenges before. Slavery, pandemics, a Great Depression, 2 world wars, a Cold War, and even a Civil War. But over and over, against the odds, we have risen to the challenge and we've met the moment. For 2.5 centuries, we somehow have always found a way not just to muddle through and survive, but to emerge better and stronger than we were before. And that history, our history, proves that we need not rely on magical thinking, nor depend, like Dr. Samuel Johnson's twice married gentleman, on the triumph of hope over experience. On the contrary, we can believe in America precisely because of our experience. And what our experience tells us is that even in days of doubt and eras of existential challenge, America's best days have always proved to be ahead of us and never behind us. Perhaps that is reason enough to believe that for us as Americans, the past truly can be prologue. So to paraphrase a young and inspirational president who galvanized my own generation, let us go forth with courage and conviction, united in our resolve to heal this land we love, asking His blessing and His help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. I thank you all for coming tonight.
Dale?